I'm really, thank you, Jeremy. I'll reintroduce myself in case there's new folks in the room, in the Zoom room. My name is Emna Almadome. I work at the Othering and Belonging Institute as a policy and research analyst. Most of my work is focused on corporate power and also on pathways to rebuilding community power in government, to the workplace, in the classroom, and beyond. Like I said, this work on kind of the intersection between our othering and belonging work and technology is relatively new for us, and we're really excited to be doing this in partnership with all the folks that brought this space together, but also with Shay and Jennifer. So I'm really excited to introduce them shortly. So we started today kind of hearing how EdTech tools have reshaped relationships and our learning and teaching experiences. I think the breakout groups were a really, really wonderful time for folks to dig into a specific tool. I know my group got into e-courses, Google Docs, like I think it's an endless list, and kind of got to imagine from various perspectives as students, as teaching assistants, what kind of power we have or what we wish we had or what we want to know more about. So really, really glad for that time and glad to dig in to this next session. So we're going to zoom out from Berkeley and look at thinking about how education technologies interact with other systems. So in particular, the policing of students and families, especially students and families of color. There was a lot of interest earlier on kind of understanding how these tools are used in a K through 12 setting, and we'll have a chance to do that today. We'll also dig into some of those similarities that are very scary similarities between technologies used in prisons and in the classroom. It was mentioned earlier the way that e-proctoring tools rely on, facial recognition and on some of these technologies that are very poorly tested and have a lot of inaccuracies in addition to the other problems we got into. So I'm excited to introduce our two speakers to share with us their work in this space, from advocacy to being educators themselves. And I also want to flag and plug some pieces that they wrote in response to a call for papers that our team had last year. So I will drop that in the chat just so you have it, and it will be on our reading list that was mentioned earlier. So I will kick off introducing Jennifer. Thank you so much for being here, Jennifer. Jennifer Jones is a staff attorney for the Technology and Civil Liberties program at the ACLU of Northern California, where she defends and promotes civil rights and civil liberties in the digital age, with a focus on work at the intersection of government surveillance, immigrants' rights, and racial justice. Thanks, Jennifer, for being here. I will also then introduce Shay. Shay Swager is a queer neurodivergent librarian and PhD student in education and critical studies at the University of Colorado, Denver. As a very recent update, Shay will also be a senior researcher in data sharing, ethics, and research at the Future of Privacy Forum starting next month. Congrats. His research is on surveillance, privacy, abolition, and pedagogy. He also has 3 chickens and a cat. So thank you both for being here. Thanks to our audience for sticking around. We are very, very open to you jumping in over chat like we were earlier. I'll be making time for questions at the end, but I have a couple to start us off. So in the pieces that I linked in the chat, I really, really appreciated both of you did took the time and were intentional in including references and citations to organizations that I think we should all be learning from, especially Black thinkers and Black-led organizations. So I'll plug some of the examples, like Bettina Love's work on abolitionist teaching, the Advancement Project's really, really great historical piece on the call to action for police-free schools. And I think what I find really interesting about your writing and work and what is referenced is that some of this might not even directly name technology or technological tools, but rather bring to the forefront and remind us of a longer history of how schools can be places that end up suppressing critical thinking or that falsely present forms of control as a form of safety or care. And also that there's been a really long history of identifying this, of pushing back, and of reimagining, which we had some conversation about already today. Like what new could we instead have? So my first question, and Jennifer, I'll start with you. How do these new technologies like e-proctoring or student surveillance software how do they reflect that history? How do they tie back?
Sure. Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me today. I'm excited to be here and to be a part of this conversation. So I think I'll start by just saying that the extensive student surveillance that we're seeing now and the increasing deployment of digital tools to monitor students is certainly not only a predictable trend. If you take a close look at, how schools have historically responded to national crises involving things like public health or public safety, and also how schools historically have responded to progressive movements and the role that they've played in trying to quell those movements. I think in either case tells us that, we should be concerned with this general trend toward online monitoring of students and sort of what the implications of such pervasive surveillance are. Back to the first point, I think the increasing surveillance technologies like Gaggle, GoGuardian, et cetera, that we're currently seeing certainly predated COVID-19, but appears to have really ramped up since 2020 when we had this broad transition to online learning due to mass school closures. In March 2020, we know that nearly all of California's K-12 public school students experienced these widespread school closures. I think more than 5.7 million of the state's nearly 6 million students transitioned in-person instruction to distancing. And that sort of widespread shutdown of schools led to this unprecedented rise in online learning. And part of that transition was schools entering into partnerships with these online safety management vendors. And I put that in quotes because that is sort of how these tech companies are branding these technologies. And these technologies are supposed to be able to aid administrators in, watching students' activities while they're using any like hardware or software that school districts have been providing for students for purposes of online learning. And these systems typically include machine learning technology that is supposed to block potentially harmful content and images. It's designed to flag keywords, citations, and internet searches. And the purpose is so that it can supposedly identify like a student's intent to harm themselves or to harm others. And then there's sort of this human review component of blocked content and any sort of flags that the software finds, where tech employees and school district personnel are sort of given the authority to evaluate the flags or the incidents that are raised and conduct any necessary follow-up, including contacting law enforcement in some cases that are perceived to be very serious. But I think the idea that these surveillance technologies can prevent tragedies or sort of like single-handedly address these very complex social problems is not new. Gaggle and GoGuardian at this point have been part of the public school experience for a lot of students for many years. And we know that many of these systems were aggressively marketed to schools in the wake of many tragic school shootings that have happened across the country. And this includes in the aftermath of the 2018 Parkland, Florida school shooting, for example. We know that that's a point where many school districts started to really expand their surveillance arsenal to include social media monitoring, tools like facial recognition and location data tracking, among other technologies. And the point of acquiring and deploying these technologies is to prevent further school violence. That's the justification that's given. So since the Parkland shooting, we know that businesses like Gaggle, Securely, and GoGuardian have netted close to $3 billion annually in the US, and that's just from peddling these products to schools. So that brings us to why this is a problem. These vendors claim that their products do really good things, like protecting student safety and ensuring their well-being by blocking them from seeing potentially harmful content, and trying to protect students from things that happen online that are really harmful, like cyberbullying. The problem is that these claims, are largely unsupported. They really are just marketing claims. They're unsupported by any sort of sound independent research. And again, they're largely proffered by tech company spokespersons. We do know that there is a lot of independent research that has consistently demonstrated that surveillance methods are actually not effective at preventing incidents of violence on school campuses. And there's even less data that sort of supports the efficacy of surveillance systems in preventing bullying or harassment. So I think it's safe to say that there really is, an asymmetry between the purported benefits of these technologies and their demonstrated effectiveness. What we do know is that the harm that many students experience when they feel like they're being closely surveilled at school, when they feel like they're being watched all the time, that actually is very harmful. In the aftermath of the Columbine shooting back in the 1990s, for example, we witnessed a dramatic increase in the amount of police officers or school resource officers who were being deployed to school campuses. There was also an increase in the installation of metal detectors on campuses and an increase in the frequency with which students were being physically searched or had their lockers and belongings searched. And this very large officer presence, we know, fell disproportionately on students of color and in communities of color. Made young people feel very unsafe and so targeted on school campuses, and that it continues to do so. So we can, I think, really understand what is happening currently as sort of a continuation of this pattern, right? We're faced with very pressing, very serious social problems at the moment. And I think that schools want to ensure that their students are safe and secure and that their needs are addressed, but their sort of approach to accomplishing this often misses the mark and ends up punishing and causing more harm to students instead. I think that was true of installing more police on campuses post-Columbine, and it certainly remains true of using surveillance software to spy on students online 24 hours a day. I also want to briefly touch on the second point I made in the beginning regarding also how schools in schools as far back as the 1940s. And at that time, we know that many officers were deployed to K through 12 campuses to suppress youth-led organizing, suppress youth-led movements for racial justice, sometimes under the pretense of protecting school property as schools became more integrated. We know that student participation in ongoing Black and Chicano freedom movements in the 60s sort of directly led to that installation of so-called school resource officers on campuses, and that trend has sort of continued. And I think if you sort of analyze surveillance technology with that historical knowledge, I think it really raises a lot of red flags when you consider the political moment that we're in right now, where there is this very strong backlash that is happening against racial justice and LGBTQ plus justice movements. And K through 12 schools have really become a site of a great deal of that backlash, with many states now passing legislation that really aims to suppress the teaching of ethnic studies, the teaching of critical history, and the teaching about sexuality, gender identity. I think when you have a backlash like this, these are moments where it becomes very clear precisely why surveillance technologies, even when they're deployed with good intent, as we see with technologies like Gaggle, they're supposed to aid in benefiting students' mental health. That's how they're advertised. They can always end up being exploited in a way that further entrenches inequities and continues to oppress marginalized groups. So I think the idea that there is this surveillance infrastructure currently in place, that certainly will make it easier for schools to monitor whether students are learning or writing or talking about race and gender identity and sexuality, I think that's very concerning, and it gives us, yet another important reason to really push back on normalizing this tech in schools.
Thank you, Jennifer, for walking us through that history and some of those specific moments in time. And Shay, I'm excited to turn to you because I love that we have this kind of being able to hear a little bit more about the K through 12 setting. And then from my understanding, Shay, your work has mainly focused on e-proctoring and in particular a higher education setting. So very, very happy to turn it to you to add to this.
Yeah, first of all, Jennifer, that was wonderful. I want to learn more about the SROs and the civil rights organizing. That is fascinating. I'm not surprised, but yeah. So I wanted to respond a little bit to some of the things that Jennifer was saying. I think it's really important that we frame, I'll call it carceral logic, or the, it's not an evidence-based approach. Like cops never make anything safer. They never actually reduce crime or improve public safety. But it's important to think about carceral logic as not an evidence-based anything. It is an ideology. And it is, when you frame it as an ideology, it's more understandable. And so you can apply it, carceral logic, to pedagogy, and you can call it carceral pedagogy. And it is an approach to education or to organizations in general that center suspicion and distrust and control. And I think it's really good to look back historically and see how this operates. I want a quick shout out to a book called Teaching Machines by Audrey Waters. It just came out, and it's trying to go through like pre-digital technology, how like oh, nice. So one of the things that I think it's helpful to think about technology is that it has a kind of DNA. That technology is a social construction that in some ways takes on the elements of the people that created it and the context in which it was created. And it's very difficult to lose that over time. And so technologies that were maybe invented for one sector, when they move over to a different sector, they still have some of that central DNA. So like CompStat was one of the first predictive policing technologies that came out in the 90s. That kind of technology has then been applied to other sectors like education, but it never loses sort of that central DNA of control and surveillance and distrust for the purpose of, approaching students like criminals. So when you see companies like Microsoft making tools for the police, and it goes really well, and they're like, maybe this, would work in this other market, they don't, fundamentally shift an understanding of learning or what a student is or what is required for a healthy educational environment. They can just move that thing over from one to the other, maybe rebrand it with a different logo and sell it to administrators, because both city governments and school administrators have a fundamental trust in a carceral ideology. So that means we approach students with suspicion. So I think one of the best ways to respond to this is with an abolitionist framework. So the way I approach like mass incarceration is, I think abolition is the right response. And I think the way to approach carceral pedagogy is with abolitionist pedagogy. So like, yes, shout out to Bettina Love. I think they're the person that I learn from most when it comes to how to do that well. But I once heard someone say that abolition actually already exists today. It's just only for certain people. So you can go to rich white suburbs that have all the resources, that have all the mental health care, that have all the healthcare and education and housing, and there's no cops in those neighborhoods. Like they are not treated with the same distrust and suspicion that poor Black communities are treated with. And so there are pockets in the US right now that are living sort of the abolitionist hope of being able to live with agency, being able to live with autonomy and have access to all the resources that you need to thrive. So it is possible. But anytime we've had a situation where people felt safe, and we'll say white, rich, cishet people felt safe, and someone that's otherized has come into that setting, then you start to have carceral logic kick in. And then you have mechanisms of control and mistrust and surveillance kick in. So like when women tried to join college, like everyone lost their shit. And then when like poor people tried to join college, we did the whole thing over again. And that's when you start to see mechanisms of things like surveillance technology kick in. And it shows up in the marketing too. So like one of the, some of the earlier marketing for e-proctoring was, now that everyone's teaching or learning online, who knows who's joining the classroom, and how can we trust them? And we don't know if they're cheating. And the subtext is that it's not the traditional student. And so non-traditional students tend to be more people of color. It tends to be maybe more first-gen students. It tends to be people that have been traditionally excluded. And so if we understand that suspicion, impulse, and carceral logic as a form of exclusion of othering, again, it doesn't help like dismantle it, but it does make more sense as to how it operates. And if we can understand how carceral logic is weaving in and out of these kinds of technologies, it informs our advocacy and pushback going forward. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but Emnet, I'd love to see where you want to take this next.
Yeah, no, this is wonderful. And I was thinking a little bit about mapping this to our earlier conversation on, around organizing and around what can be done to like take more agency in these situations, because we are dealing with such a long history. And like Jennifer, you were saying that there's kind of an operation that's been set up to address progressive movements when there is a movement happening. The system is kind of ready to whether it's from an administrator's perspective, or what I think has come up in both of our conversations is the tech companies, the corporate side of things, where there's vendors who have more of a marketing orientation and can sell themselves really, really well, whether it's to knowing or an unknowing audience. And so I want to kind of talk about that a little bit, is this rising investment in these types of technologies, despite all of what we've gone through, right? Like it doesn't work. There's a lot of history that proves that. It came up in our other conversation too. What's going on? What's that mismatch? And some of it is just I would love to talk the source of that mismatch. And I'd also like to tie it to one of our breakout groups earlier was kind of trying to talk through what type of agency do students have in these decisions. And I know at least in my group, we kind of came up dry. We were like, well, we're going through all the different power dynamics and we got a little stuck. So I would love to hear some examples of your work or other organizations that you have learned from. Where do you see folks trying to build or confront power to change this mismatch between where we're investing funds now and where we know there might be a better use of them?
Sure, I can take the first stab at that answer. I think it really does come down to power. Obviously, these tech companies have an unprecedented amount of power and money. I think they're able to easily get in the ears of administrators who I think really have a strong desire for an easy, quick, sort of efficient answer. And these tech companies are really good at convincing schools, and other government agencies. We see this a lot with police agencies, that they have that very easy, very quick, efficient answer. And I think it makes it really easy to get schools to sort of quickly adopt their solution rather than consulting with folks who are directly impacted, which is students and parents. So, in our advocacy around this issue, one place where we really try to confront power is at school board meetings, where the budget is usually debated and discussed and voted on. We really encourage students and parents and organizers to show up at these meetings and educate administrators on the threats that these tools pose to students, and just really demand proper investment-based and that are non-punitive. And this can be effective. We have had organizations like the ACLU affiliates and others rely on their state without folks noticing. They're very secretive. And so I think showing up at these meetings in very organized fashion and educating administrators and demanding the right resources is one way to really confront power and force them to address the mismatch in priorities and investment, and just let them know that parents and students are watching. And they're going to demand what they know works for
Shay,
them.
I'd love to turn it to you, and especially if you have reflections on a higher education setting, that would be awesome.
I think my advice will be specifically for higher ed, just because I have more experience there. My number one recommendation, no matter where you are in the organization, is to unionize. And that's generally true for like almost any topic. I'll tell you to unionize. I think unions can be a really powerful way to push back against not only policies or legislation or practices. I'm a union member, and I think we've been able to do some work that like a faculty committee would never do. So step one, if you're a student, you can join a student union. If you don't have a union, you can form a union. Student government can be helpful if you're a student. They can be a little more conservative depending on the institution, and especially primarily white institutions can be more conservative for student governments. I'm always a fan of protesting. I think protesting can be an effective means, but there's going to be differential risk. And so this is when I never want to encourage someone to risk their safety, especially since risk is going to be contextual. And so there's a lot of reasons why someone might have more risk than others. And so if you could find someone in your community that will have less risk, that's willing to do that kind of advocacy, have them do that. If you are an educator, you should also unionize. And you can join faculty committees, and you can join different kinds of faculty-led groups that push on changing how we teach. So there are definitely organizations and committees in my institution that work on like ungrading and critical digital pedagogy and things that are alternatives. Because one of the main ways that administrators like to short stop these conversations of academic integrity or whatever the reason they're saying that they need to adopt surveillance technology is, well, if we don't use this, what then? What's the alternative? And if someone doesn't have an alternative, even if it's just don't harm people, which should be sufficient to say don't use this, having an alternative of here's a class that they've done it and it's worked. And so we've been able to have some we did it in a history class, and then the pushback was, well, that won't work in STEM. And so then we did it in a STEM class, and they're like, well, that won't work online. And then we did it in a STEM online class. And they're like, okay, well, that won't work in large scale. And then so we just keep going and expanding out those kinds of practices and communities of that provide alternatives, and that can be helpful. If you're an administrator, I generally don't trust you. And I have lots of friends who are administrators, and so I have feelings about this around if you are in this position, it's because you've already made some compromises as to what you think education should look like. However, if you are legitimately open to these kinds of reforms, I think your job is to listen to students. Your job is to listen to teachers, but not all teachers, because I don't trust some teachers who are very invested in the carceral pedagogies we're talking about. But specifically listen to the people that are being harmed, because those are the people that have the most to lose and have the highest risk. And I think your obligation is to try to center their particular concerns. And so I don't have like a specific recommendation. Obviously, don't use these technologies. Don't surveil students. Start trusting students and see like what that does. It's kind of
Yeah.
this weird intersection where doing the right thing is also doing the financially smart thing. Like if you do equity work well, you'll actually it'll help students and they might stay in your university longer. And so you'll have higher retention rates and higher tuition. So, and I hate to make an economic argument because that's not the reason you should be doing this. But if you're an administrator and you need to make an argument to your board or your regents or your provost, you can say by dropping this, we're actually going to improve students, success and experience, and therefore will actually be more solvent because of it. Yeah, so unionize, cause a ruckus, do some protesting, call me if you need someone to talk to or strategize with. I'm happy to serve as an advocate if I can.
Awesome. Yeah, this is great to hear kind of the whole spectrum of different things that people can do, whether it's, showing up where decisions are made, at the school board meetings, and kind of thinking of alternative ways of building power. To connect again to our earlier conversation where we had folks from a legal perspective and from an administrative perspective. And since we also have a lawyer with us here, I'll switch to another question before we take one from the chat is, there is already some privacy regulation. I think, Jennifer, you laid this out in your paper of there is already some requirement to seek consent for the use of new technologies and provide alternatives where consent is not granted. And I'd love to hear a little bit about, how does that actually play out? How do people claim this right to privacy? If you want to speak a little bit on that.
Sure. So, honestly, it's really been difficult to get a strong sense of how this has been playing out during the rise in virtual learning. I can't necessarily speak to how frequently students and families are invoking their privacy rights and asking for alternatives to online surveillance. But I do think I can speculate fairly confidently that it's probably not happening as often as it should. And I think part of the problem with that is transparency. It has been really difficult, even from an attorney's perspective who's been really focused on these issues. It's been hard for us to get a strong sense of how many schools are utilizing these technologies through Public Records Act requests. I think one of the issues that we run into is the fact that these businesses often are able to remain secretive because there are these exceptions in Public Records Act that protect proprietary information, and really just sort of creates a lot of obstacles in learning whether and how technologies are being used, even when they are being used by public agencies like schools. So personally, I first learned about this technology from a concerned parent who by coincidence just happened to be a parent of a child who's very interested in privacy and privacy law, and sort of just took it upon themselves to do a little bit of their own investigating and questioning their school about the use of the monitoring system that they had deployed. Taking that initiative, however, to learn more about and effectively challenge a school policy around a particular technology, of course, it takes time. It takes resources. It takes paying very close attention to all of the overwhelming paperwork I know that is sent home for parents to sign. And I think the reality is that because it does take a lot of time and it does take a significant amount of resources, I would imagine that this does impact low income and higher income families differently, right? If you don't have the ability to take time off work to go meet with school officials or consult with the ACLU, consult with another legal aid group about the issue, you simply may not be in a position to assert your rights. If you come from a marginalized group, for example, if you are an undocumented student, I think there's also the fear that, challenging the system at all, invoking your privacy rights, or challenging a school policy can be much more intimidating, scary, because there is the real threat and fear, of course, that some retaliatory action might be taken. And then it becomes an unfortunate calculation that has to be made of which harm is worse. So I think certainly socioeconomic status, it can really determine whether someone's privacy rights are protected. And I think that disparity really speaks, again, to the need for more transparency on the part of schools. and a much more accessible process for pushing back on the deployment of technologies. And at minimum, giving families a meaningful opportunity to opt out of their use.
Definitely. And we don't have questions in the chat, but I do remember one from earlier, so I'm going to raise it, is what are the unique privacy and or surveillance challenges presenting students and families who are English language learners or immigrants? I know we've talked about, kind of the disparate impact in terms of race and income, but maybe if there's any specific things you've come across in terms of language access, or proximity to like American experience, things like that.
I don't know, which is a fair answer. I will say that there can be like overlapping identities, and so like, intersectional oppression is going to be common, especially with those populations you mentioned. But I guess the expectation of privacy for test taking, and when I say privacy, I mean like I have a quiet office room that I can go to. Like that's what I'm in now. I can close the door, and if there's other people in the house, that's not going to interfere with my ability to be on this call with you all. That's not an expectation that, or a resource everyone has. And so if you're a student and you're trying to take a test, but you don't have a space to yourself, or if you're experiencing homelessness and you're like living out of your car, you don't have privacy and space and quiet in a way that maybe other students have. And so that might be something that would come into play.
Definitely, when you think about
No.
Just interacting with the lived environment. So much of this seems like it's just about your digital experience, but how does it interact with your home, and the fact that these are now, there's been a shift, right, where there's more in person or hybrid, but obviously this is something we might be dealing with longer term. So yeah, thanks for raising that as well.
And like, the settings don't, like, I have my background Zoom, so you can't like see into my space, but if that was unZoom, you could see like things in my life that might give you clues about my religious identity or political affiliations. And so like being able to see in my space will tell you things about me that might change how you interact with me as a student or a teacher. And so if like if I had, a Communist Manifesto poster on my wall, which now sounds like a wonderful idea that I should put up on my wall for future meetings, I think it would change how you feel about me. And if you were responsible for assessing me and you had strong negative feelings about that, like, of course it's going to impact, at least on a subconscious level. And it doesn't mean you're going to grade me worse, but it does mean that it is a trigger for implicit bias or a trigger for explicit bias. I did want to jump back to one thing about the informed consent. I would argue there's no consent involved. It is not possible. Because if it is assigned by a teacher in any circumstance, you don't have the choice not to do the assignment. And the only ways that I've ever heard of students getting out of this is because of disability accommodations or going to like an office of equity, which is essentially like our version of like, I think I'm being discriminated against. Like, I want to wear hijab or I want to wear niqab, and this is not allowing for that because the software says that it's not validating my face. And so I've seen exercises of pushback around like protected classes that the university is scared of getting sued by, but not in any sort of like consent that we would normally associate with like an educational setting.
Thank you. And I had missed one question around kind of the complexity of dealing with who's harassed in different spaces, and the idea that how might we define security in an educational context, and what sort of interventions would that different concept suggest? And Deirdre is bringing up the work of Project Greenlight, I believe based in Detroit, that, juxtaposes the image of a surveillance camera with, a porch chair, right? So still having that idea of like, we're looking out for each other, but in a very different way. I would love to, with our last few minutes before breakout groups, if there's any thoughts on that. And then I'll just put these back together, these questions back to back. Does education policy trump CCPA, and I hope Jennifer's still with us because I'm not sure I know what CCPA is. Does invoking legitimate educational interest circumvent CCPA? So I think Jennifer might have dropped on accident, but we could start with the first one. Shay, if you have thoughts a little bit on kind of alternative visions of security.
So I don't know Project Greenlight specifically, but I'm looking them up right now. And it looks like a partnership with the police and surveillance cameras. Those are two big red flags for me. So, well, I can't say like, objectively it's good or bad.
Or this was an alternative to.
Oh, an alternative to project. Okay,
Right.
good. Then we're on the same page. Yeah. It's trash. Don't worry. So I want to make sure that we're defining security. I don't like the word security. I would say safety or care. Security usually means like police are involved, or it can also be a different word of saying civility, which is like a very white middle class conception of what a public meeting and discourse should look like. I don't care about civility. Like I don't care if people are rude or like say the F word. I care about kindness and care. And so I'm okay with having contentious public meetings or public hearings as long as care is the center. And I feel like a lot of those like protocols of civility or nicety are meant to protect power rather than center care. So I would say in general, public meetings have not been places that I've ever experienced care. Like if you've gone to a public meeting, I don't walk out, or you probably haven't walked up like, I feel so good right now. Like I just feel seen and loved or otherwise thought about. And so I don't necessarily think that they are great locations to say that this is where we should be experiencing that. I think that they should be probably contestations of power, and that's never going to feel super safe. I don't know. I would love to have someone else respond to that, or even a question or say more.
Definitely. Yeah. And we'll have time afterwards as well. Like in our visioning session, I think this will be a great topic. We'll be able to have different visions to work through. And I think that's a very meaty one.